All right, so you're here because you want to get up to speed quickly on some really crucial cybersecurity stuff, right?
I'd say it's a pretty safe bet.
Yeah. And today we're diving deep into a couple of pretty fascinating concepts. Quantum key distribution, we'll call it QKD for short.
Makes sense?
And then something I think most people are at least somewhat familiar with, multi-factor authentication or MFA.
Right.
So to help us get through all this, we're going to be taking a look at a really interesting article written by Michael Twining. He's currently a cybersecurity undergrad at Utica University, and he's specializing in cyber operations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he's actually on track to graduate pretty soon in May 2025. But he's already got a pretty impressive background in this field. He holds the CompTIA Security Plus and the ISC2 certified in cybersecurity
So he
credentials.
clearly knows his stuff.
Exactly. And you can really see that passion that he has for cybersecurity,
Yeah.
for making the digital world safer for everybody, shine through in his writing.
Yeah, for sure. Passion is super important when you're trying to stay ahead of the curve in a field that's constantly evolving like cybersecurity.
Couldn't agree more. And that actually brings us to the mission for this deep dive.
Hmm.
We want to give you a crystal clear understanding of what QKD and MFA are on their own,
Right.
what each one brings to the table in terms of security,
Okay.
and then the really interesting part, what happens when you start thinking about using them together, not as like separate tools, but as
Okay.
part of a combined strategy.
Yeah.
The goal is to equip you with some really solid knowledge about these two important security technologies, but without, getting too bogged down in the technical weeds.
I like it. Straight to the point, practical information that people can actually use.
Yeah, exactly. So let's kick things off by venturing into the world of quantum mechanics with QKD.
Okay, sounds good.
So in the simplest terms possible,
Sure.
what exactly is quantum key distribution?
Okay, so at its core, QKD is a way to securely exchange cryptographic keys over a distance. And it does this by using, you guessed it, the principles of quantum mechanics. You can kind of think of it like a super secure way to create a shared secret between two parties.
Okay, so I'm getting a sense that this is like next level cryptography.
Mhm.
But traditional cryptography relies on math problems that are really hard to solve, right?
Exactly. But QKD, it takes a totally different approach. It leverages these fundamental laws of physics to make sure that communication is secure. So instead of relying on complex algorithms that could potentially be broken, QKD is all about the behavior of, well, light, really.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking about like the actual behavior of light.
Yep.
So how does that actually translate into a secret key?
Okay, so imagine this.
Yep.
The sender, let's call her Alice.
Okay.
Alice transmits a series of photons. These are basically tiny little packets of light to the receiver. We'll call him Bob. Each photon has these special quantum properties, like its polarization. You can kind of think of polarization like the direction the light wave is vibrating. It's just one example of a quantum property that we can use to encode information. So Bob receives these photons from Alice and measures their properties to figure out the key. Now, here's where things get really interesting, and this is where the quantum mechanics really comes into play.
Okay, I'm listening.
Because of these really weird, really cool laws of quantum mechanics, any attempt to intercept these photons,
So if somebody's trying to eavesdrop.
right, even just trying to observe these photons in any way, causes a disturbance
Oh, wow.
in their quantum state. And this disturbance, this change, it's detectable by both Alice and Bob. So they know immediately that somebody's been trying to listen in.
So if I'm getting this right, it's like if someone's trying to eavesdrop, the very act of them trying to listen changes the message itself.
Precisely.
That is wild.
Yeah.
And that's completely different from, like you said, traditional encryption, where you're just hoping that a math problem is too hard to crack, right?
Exactly. And that's actually one of the big advantages that Michael Twining really highlights in his article. QKD provides this level of security that is literally rooted in the laws of physics. Undetected interception, it's pretty much impossible. You can't outsmart the laws of physics.
Right. Exactly.
Now, compare that to something like MFA, multi-factor authentication. It's a great security measure, don't get me wrong, but it can still be vulnerable to things like dictionary attacks, especially if somebody's using a weak password as one of their factors, or phishing, where someone might trick you into giving up one of your authentication factors.
Yeah, very true. You bring up another interesting point from the article. QKD is really good for scaling up to large organizations because it doesn't rely on a central key server or database.
Right?
Can you explain why that's such a big deal?
Yeah, absolutely. So picture a huge organization with a really complicated network, lots of devices, lots of users.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Managing all those cryptographic keys can be a real nightmare. With traditional public key infrastructure, what we call PKI, you often have these central authorities that issue certificates. And it can get messy, especially when you're trying to manage all these certificates across a really large distributed network.
Yeah, that sounds like a headache.
Big time.
Mm.
But QKD is different. It lets you establish secure keys directly between the two parties who are trying to communicate without needing to rely on this big centralized infrastructure.
Gotcha.
And that means more flexibility, especially when you're dealing with things like securing communications in a network where everything's spread out.
Okay, so for these like really big, complex networks.
Yeah, or maybe even large-scale Internet of Things deployments, what we call IoT, lots of little devices all talking to each other.
Right, right. QKD could be a really good fit for that. Now, the article also mentions that QKD is good at preventing replay attacks.
Yeah, that's another big
So
plus.
for someone who's not super familiar with that term,
Right.
can you break down exactly what a replay attack is?
Yeah, so a replay attack, it happens when an attacker somehow manages to get a hold of your valid authentication data. This could be something like your login credentials or a session token. And then later on, they try to reuse that stolen data to gain access to your account or system. It's kind of like if someone stole your house key and then tried to use it to get into your house the next day.
Right, so they're basically recording something and then playing it back later to try to trick the system.
Exactly. But with QKD, it's a lot harder to pull off a replay attack. That's because QKD is constantly generating these brand new cryptographic keys, and they're negotiated in real time based on the photons that are being transmitted. So if an attacker did manage to intercept one of these keys,
Yeah.
it would probably be useless by the time they actually tried to use it because the keys are constantly changing. They would have to be able to intercept the key and derive it, all in that exact same moment of communication.
Wow. Okay, so it's like a moving target, basically.
Exactly. And that makes replay attacks against a QKD system incredibly difficult.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about QKD, and it offers some really strong security advantages, but it's not the only tool that's out there.
Of course not.
So let's shift gears and talk about multi-factor authentication, or MFA. I think most of us have run into this in our daily lives by now.
Yeah, definitely. Most online accounts offer it these days.
Right, exactly. So can you explain in simple terms what is MFA?
Basically, it's a way to prove that you are who you say you are. It does this by requiring you to provide multiple pieces of evidence, or what we call factors, before you're allowed to access something, like an account or a system. The idea is that even if an attacker manages to compromise one of your factors,
Mm-hmm.
they're still going to have a much harder time getting in because they still need to get past the other factors.
Makes sense, like adding extra locks to your door.
Exactly.
Michael's article outlines three main types of these factors.
Right.
Can you walk us through them?
Sure. So the first type is something you know. This is usually something like a password or a PN. It's basically information that only you should have stored in your memory.
Okay.
The second type is something you have. This could be a physical device like a security key fob, one of those little gadgets that generates codes, or a smart card,
Yeah.
or it could even be your smartphone. A lot of services now use authenticator apps or send one-time codes via SMS.
Right, right.
The important thing here is that you need to have that specific device to get in. And then the third type of factor is something you are. And this refers to biometrics.
Oh, okay. So like your fingerprint or your face.
Exactly. It's those unique biological characteristics that, well, make you you. So things like fingerprint scanning, facial recognition, even iris scans.
Okay, that makes sense. So a common scenario might be you enter your password, which is something you know,
Right.
and then you get a push notification on your smartphone asking you to confirm that it's really you trying to log in. So that's something you have.
Exactly. And each additional factor makes it exponentially harder for an attacker to get in compared to just having to crack a password. It's all about layers of security.
So basically, it's a huge pain for the attacker.
Pretty much. Now, this leads us to a really intriguing question that Michael kind of hints at in his article. What happens if you were to use both QKD and MFA together?
Okay, yeah, because at first glance, it sounds like an unbeatable combination.
Right, like Fort Knox level security.
But are there any downsides, any challenges to think about if you try to combine these two powerful technologies?
Well, as with anything in cybersecurity, it's never quite that simple. And the article does bring up a few potential issues. The first one is the added complexity to your security infrastructure.
Okay, so it's not just plug and play.
Not quite. When you're using both QKD for secure key exchange and MFA for user authentication, you're basically running two separate and potentially pretty complicated security systems at the same time. And that inevitably adds layers of complexity to your entire setup. You're going to need people with specialized knowledge to set it up initially, to maintain it, to monitor it, and you need to make sure those two systems can actually talk to each other and work together smoothly.
Right, so it's not just about getting it up and running, it's the long-term management of these two complex systems.
Exactly. And if you're not super careful, that increased complexity could actually lead to new vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, things like that.
And the article also mentioned potential compatibility issues between different QKD and MFA technologies. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a really important thing to keep in mind. The world of QKD and MFA, it's still kind of in its early stages. Things are developing quickly. Not every system out there is designed to play nice with each other. So you might run into situations where you need to find workarounds or even develop custom solutions to get them to work together. And this lack of interoperability can really limit your options when it comes to choosing vendors.
Yeah.
It can lead to some pretty big integration headaches.
And it's not as simple as just picking your favorite QKD solution and your favorite MFA solution and assuming they'll automatically work together.
Unfortunately not.
And then there's the cost factor, which, let's be honest, it's a big consideration for any organization, especially when you're talking about security.
Well, absolutely. Cost is always a factor.
It can't be ignored. So setting up and maintaining both a cutting-edge QKD infrastructure and a really good MFA system, that's going to require a pretty substantial investment, right?
It will.
Mm.
Especially if you're trying to roll this out across a large organization. Both of these things involve significant upfront costs. The hardware, the software, finding people with the expertise to manage it all. Plus, you've got the ongoing costs of keeping everything running and maintained.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, combining QKD and MFA, it definitely bumps up the total cost of ownership for your security infrastructure.
Right. It's a trade-off.
Yeah, you get this incredibly strong security, but you pay a premium for it. And for some organizations, that trade-off might be worth it. If they're dealing with extremely sensitive information, or if they're really worried about future threats, like attacks that use quantum computers,
Right.
then that rock-solid security that QKD offers, it might be worth the cost and the complexity. But for a lot of organizations, especially smaller ones, maybe they're running a small business, implementing a really solid MFA strategy. That's going to be a much more practical approach.
Right. Focus on the here and now.
Exactly. Focus on the most common threats that you're actually likely to face. And for some, the best approach might be a kind of hybrid approach. Maybe they use QKD for a few very specific high-risk areas and then rely on MFA for the rest of their systems.
Okay, so we've explored how QKD uses quantum mechanics to provide really strong security, how it's good for scaling up to larger organizations, and how it's tough to beat when it comes to preventing replay attacks.
Right.
We've also talked about how MFA uses those multiple factors of authentication to verify identity and how that makes things much more secure. And we've touched on some of the challenges of combining those two approaches, the increased complexity, the potential compatibility issues, and the higher costs.
Right. It's a lot to consider.
It is. So bringing this all together for our listener, what are the big takeaways here?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that both QKD and MFA are valuable tools in the fight against cyber threats. And neither one is inherently better than the other. It really depends on the specific situation. And Michael Twining's article does a great job of highlighting this point.
Yeah, I agree.
The decision of whether to implement QKD or MFA or maybe some combination of the two, it really boils down to a few key things. First, what are your organization's specific security needs? How sensitive is the data that you're trying to protect? What are the biggest threats that you're facing right now? And then, of course, what resources do you have available? What's your budget? Do you have the technical expertise to manage these systems?
It's all about making a smart, informed decision based on your specific risk profile.
Exactly.
So, for example, if you're an organization that handles extremely sensitive information and you're really concerned about the possibility of quantum computers being used to break encryption in the future, then QKD, even though it's complex and it can be expensive, it might be the right choice for you.
It might be.
But for a lot of organizations, having a strong, well-managed MFA strategy is going to be more than enough to protect them from the most common threats out there.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And remember, this isn't just some abstract theoretical discussion. In the world we live in today, where everything is interconnected, having strong authentication and making sure that your key exchange is secure is absolutely crucial. This applies to everything from protecting your own personal information online to securing critical infrastructure that we all rely on.
Absolutely. And all of this really leads to an important question that I'd like you, our listener, to think about. We've talked about the potential of quantum mechanics to provide this almost unbreakable security. And we've discussed the more practical, layered approach of multi-factor authentication. Both have their pros and cons. But given everything we've discussed, where do you think the future of data protection is headed?
It's a big question.
It is. Are we going to see everyone adopting these quantum-based security technologies in the next few years? Or will more traditional methods like MFA continue to evolve and get better at keeping up with the ever-changing threat landscape? It's a fascinating field, and things are moving so quickly, there's really no clear answer yet.
It's really exciting to think about the possibilities and the challenges. And we encourage you to consider how all of this relates to your own approach to security, whether you're thinking about it from a professional perspective or just your own personal online activities. Understanding how cybersecurity is evolving is important for everyone. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of quantum key distribution and multi-factor authentication. We hope you learned something new and maybe even got inspired to explore some of these topics further on your own.
I second that. Always good to be learning and adapting in this field.
Couldn't have said it better myself.